Seated. Well, it's great to be back with you, and my wife and I went to Texas to see family. And one of the things that we like to do at my in-laws' house, they live out in the country, at least a mile away from the nearest neighbor. We like to sit on what we call the country porch and drink coffee in the morning and overlook the hill country of Texas. It's a beautiful spot. And Monday we were doing that, and there was a large jackrabbit. Now, if you don't know what a jackrabbit is, think of a cottontail with legs 4 times as long and ears 4 times as long, and you got the picture. And so I wanted to take a picture of this jackrabbit, and so I walked to one end of the porch, I took the picture, and on the way back to the place where I was sitting, a yellow jacket stung me in the neck. Now, fortunately, I'm not allergic, and unfortunately, my response was not completely Christ-like, and just had a little knot, and it went away, and it wasn't a big deal. But I tell you that because we've been talking about valleys, and one of the things that valleys do is they show up unannounced, and they surprise us, and sometimes they're absolutely miserable moments. And not just moments, but long extended realities. And so when we've been talking about being in the valleys instead of being on the mountaintops and what it's like to hang out in the valleys, we realize that we've been talking about different kinds of valleys that we're in, different things that cause valleys. Today I want to look at this whole valley thing from a totally different perspective. I want us to look at it from God's perspective. Because one of the things that I've come to realize is that God sees my valley a lot differently than I do. Because if he saw it the way I did, he'd fix it real fast, right? He'd make it go away. And he would put me on the mountaintop again, or back out of the valley at least. And so he has a totally different perspective of what's going on when we find ourselves in the valley. He sees things in a totally different light. And so to help us understand that, I want us to look at Romans chapter 8. So I ask you if you turn with me there. And just a little background. In Romans 8, of course, the book of Romans is Paul's classic writing of faith and of doctrine and theology and encouragement that he wrote to the church in Rome. And just a very powerful, powerful letter that he wrote. So much teaching and so much that is there. And so here is one time of encouragement. And in this passage, he's acknowledging the fact that the followers of Jesus are going through very, very difficult times of persecution. And many are giving their lives, and ultimately Paul would eventually give his life. And so he's trying to encourage them in this time of despair. How do you respond to that? And so I think he helps them see and helps us see how God sees these valleys in a totally different light. So Romans 8, starting with verse 18. It's on page 1133 if you're using the Pew Bible. Romans 8:18, and we'll read through verse 30. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. There's a whole sermon there, but we're not going to talk about that today. Verse 22, we know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved, but hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently. In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. And he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified. Okay, so there is hours and hours of teaching that can be found in these passages. I want to focus on 28 through 30 and just kind of get an idea of what God sees when we go through a valley. So he says in verse 28, and remember, they're in a context of suffering, of persecution, and we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. So God looks at our valley, and he sees them as good for us. Now, I have to be honest, I've never looked at a valley and said, this is good. Is anybody else? I mean, have you ever looked at a valley that you're going through and say, wow, this is awesome. This is good for me. All right? That's not what we do. But I think it's important to understand in the Greek there's something really cool that goes on here. The word for good is an adjective, and it can also mean excellent. And so the idea is that God allows us, and that's one of the things we have to acknowledge if we're honest to Scripture, when valleys come, God allows them, at the very least, allows them. And so while we're in the valley, God is moving us toward excellence. And we'll let that soak in for a minute. He is moving us towards excellence. So in verse 29, he describes that a little, and there's a lot of theology here that's going on. This is about sanctification, not justification for you theologians. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. And so those of us who are followers of Jesus, we've been set aside by God to become Christ-like. And so here's what I want you to hear me say. We cannot become Christ-like without valleys. Oh, I wish we could. You say, well, can't we grow in our faith without valleys? Well, sure, you can grow. But can you reach excellence and become Christ-like? I wish it were so. And maybe there's been someone in history other than Jesus that's done it, but I've never heard of them. Because it's in those valleys that God transforms us and makes us more like what he wants us to be. Ouch! It hurts. One of the things that we got to do in Texas was we got to hang out with Ladine's brother and his wife. And I know I've told you before, and if you're new, you don't know this. My wife's family's been through a lot of difficulty since 2010. In 2010, my wife's sister passed away. And in the spring of 2011, her brother was diagnosed with cancer. And since 2011, he's been going through treatments. He has been through chemotherapy 3 different rounds. Not 3 different days, but 3 different rounds. And so his body's been beaten up horribly because of that. So anyway, one day we were at the kitchen table, and my son was there, and he was complaining about something silly. I don't remember what it was. I just remember my brother-in-law's response. And so he was complaining about this thing, and my brother-in-law jokingly looked at him and said, you should just be thankful you have eyebrows. Because chemotherapy gets rid of all of your hair, right? He has no hair. He said, you should just be thankful you have eyebrows. And we laughed about that. But I walked away from that, and I began to think about Cliff, is his name. I began to think about him and his journey. And thinking about, talking about valleys and realizing who he was before and who he is now. He was not an ungodly person by any stretch before he got cancer. He loved Jesus. But now, 7 years later, as I sit and I talk to him about his journey through cancer and about his faith and about who he is, the depth of who he is just phenomenal. And I sit and I listen and I learn and I talk and I hear him and it's like, wow, as horrible as this has been, he has a faith that is unshaken. He has a love for God that is deep. He has a trust that is overwhelming, that is beyond my capacity to understand. And why is that? It's because of the valley. He doesn't fear death. He doesn't fear what the world throws at him. But time after time after time, he comes out of the valley with a deeper faith and a deeper love. It's just overwhelming. And I could tell you story after story of people who've been through the valleys. I could talk about my own valleys and realize that, you know what, I look back on the valleys and understand that there's nothing that could have happened to me that would make me grow as much as that valley did. Nothing. So don't hear me say what I'm not saying. I am not encouraging you to look out and go find a valley to jump in, because they will find you if you are a follower of Jesus. You don't have to search them out. They show up, right? Don't go doing stupid things just so you can end up in a valley, right? You don't have to do that. But you find yourself in a valley, and God sees it as, all right, this is your opportunity to advance in your faith. It's kind of like we were talking about in the Welcome Center, a couple of guys and I were talking about, have you ever gone a long time without exercising and then one day decided to start exercising? Well, if you've never done that, the day after really stinks. Okay, because every part of your body is sore. Or if you start doing exercises you've never done before, right? The next day, your body just really hates you. Okay, and that's just the way it is. And I think in our spiritual journey, when we don't go through valleys, there's a part of our spiritual muscle work that's not being developed. Because the valleys force us to trust. They force us to run to God or run away from Him. I can't explain why some valleys are longer than others. I can't explain why some people have more valleys than others. I don't know. But I know they are essential for the development of our spiritual journey towards excellence. Okay? So, just as a side note here, and we'll probably address this again in a minute, I think it's very important in the valley to ask good questions. Right? The first question is to ask, am I here because of a bad decision I made? Right? Sometimes people are overcome by debt because of bad decisions they've made. You can't blame that on anybody but yourself. And maybe the valley is you stop and you look in the mirror and say, I need to change who I am. You could use all kinds of different illustrations for that, right? Am I here because of a choice I've made? Right? If not, then what is it that I'm supposed to learn in this valley? What is it God's trying to teach me? What is it He's after? What is it in my journey of faith that is not accomplished to where He wants me to be? What is He pushing me towards? Right? And then I think to ask the question, how does God want to use me in this valley? And usually that's the furthest thing from our minds in the valley. But oh my goodness, the valleys are powerful when it comes to letting people see Christ in our lives. How does God want to use me here? How does God want to not only transform me, but how does He want me to impact others? And so I think it's very important in the valley to ask good questions, because good questions can direct what is next. All right? So that's the good part of what I'm about to tell you from Romans 8. All right? Is that sometimes God is using the valley to advance our faith, and sometimes He's even using the valleys to advance somebody else's faith. Whew. That's kind of hard to take in, but it is true at times. But there's something even much bigger at stake at what's going on. At the end of verse 28, and we know that in all things God works for the good, or towards the excellence of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. The word purpose there can also mean plan. One of the things that's really hard for our little minds, at least I know it's hard for my little mind to take in, is that God is directing history to accomplish His purposes. God is directing history to accomplish His purposes. That includes your history and mine. And so He takes us on this journey, and He even takes us through these valleys so that He can accomplish His purposes and His plan. I can't understand His plan. I've been trying to understand His plan for 51 years, right? I know what the next step is. And many times that's the only information He gives me. And sometimes He changes that in mid-step, right? I don't have to understand the plan. And the plan is not about me understanding where God is headed, but to understand this reality that God is up to something so much bigger than me and so much more important than me, that the valley sometimes is about accomplishing his purpose solely. Let me explain what I mean. In John chapter 9, there is this really amazing story about a man born blind. Okay? And in this story, he had been blind his whole life, and Jesus walks by one day and heals him. Well, it happens to be a Sabbath day, and Jesus healed on the Sabbath, which made the religious leaders very angry. Okay? Because he was breaking their rules. All right? So they bring the guy in, and they have a council in front of him, and they just pelt the guy that was healed with questions. Now, who do you think this guy is? Why would he heal you on a Sabbath if he's from God? He must be from the devil. And the blind man, with no training whatsoever, looks at them and says, listen, here's what I know. I was blind, and now I see. And you can say he's from the devil if you want to, but I believe he's from God, because only somebody from God could heal a man born blind. All right, so they go through this story, and it's back and forth and back and forth. They bring the guy's parents in, and they're condemning Jesus the whole time, and it's a whole big to-do about how the Sabbath was made for men and not men for the Sabbath. And Jesus is making this incredibly huge point to the religious leaders, letting them know that their religion had become more important than God. All right? But you go back to the beginning of the story, and there's something very interesting that happens. Jesus and his disciples are walking past this man that everybody knows was born blind. He had spent decades of his life never seeing, not a thing. Never saw the trees, never saw water, never saw his parents, never saw other people, never saw anything. And so his disciples, Jesus' disciples, ask him, they see this man who was born blind, everybody knew he was born blind, and they said, Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he would be born blind? And Jesus' words are fascinating. He said, neither he didn't sin, and his parents didn't sin. He was born blind so that God could be glorified. Now, the disciples were just parroting the theology they had heard all of their lives. If something bad happens to me, it's because of sin. If something bad happens, I did something wrong, or my parents did something wrong, and so anytime anything bad happens, there's some bad in my life or my parents' life or in the past. And so it's assumed when the man's born blind that his parents must have really messed up. And Jesus said, nobody sinned. This isn't about sin. This is all so that God could be glorified. Now, process that with me. This man was born blind, spent decades of his life without the ability to see. Obviously not best for him. He was forced to be a beggar, an outcast in society. People would give as they went by, but he had no way of fending for himself, especially in that culture and time. And all of that happened, decades of misery, so that God could be glorified. Well, that's a new perspective. So when God looks at me in my valley, and that thing that is hurting me so much and so difficult for me, God is saying, listen, I'm up to something much bigger than you. And as much as I love you, you need to know it's more important than you. Really? Yeah. Because I'm directing history to accomplish my purposes. And sometimes my purpose means you have to go through a hard time. I know it's no fun. I know it hurts. But guess what? In the end, it'll all be worth it. It'll all be worth it. Because when my purposes are accomplished, the world gets back in order, as Paul was talking about in Romans 8. Whoa. So the question then is, the valleys come, and please, again, don't hear me say what I'm not saying. I'm not encouraging you to be really excited by the fact that the valley has come. That's just not real. And we have to be honest, and we have to say that there is an initial response to the valley that is miserable. And typically, at least for me, very non-Christ-like. And there's that initial emotional response that is so hard and it's just overwhelming. But that passes. And the question then is, all right, that is past. What do I do now? The valley is here. The valley is real. In my relationship with God, I understand in my head that God is either growing me or he's just accomplishing his purposes. I understand that in my head, and it still stinks. I don't like it. But what do I do now? And here's what I think we need to do, just in all practicality. The first is we need to pray. And I think we need to pray specifically, God, please give me what I need to make it through this. Just a prayer of utter dependence. I can't get through this on my own. I need your help. Give me what I need to make it through the valley. Wherever it's headed, whatever it's about, give me what I need to make it through. The second thing that I think we need to do is ask good questions. And we've already talked some about that. What is it you're trying to teach me? Is there something I'm supposed to learn here? Is there something that's supposed to transform in my soul that you want to make different? Is there some character development that's taking place in me? Is there some change that needs to happen in my life? Make that obvious to me. Or is there some ministry, somebody that needs to be touched in a positive way because of this? Is there something going on around me that I need to be aware of, that I need to connect to? That I can now connect to because I'm in this valley? Ask really good questions and let God answer. He's faithful to answer those questions, I promise. Another thing that I think we need to do is we need to lean on community. As God has given us, as followers of Jesus, a family of faith, and it's okay to put your arm around someone else's shoulder and be carried through a valley. It's okay. That's why we do what we do. That's why we're part of why we're here. That's part of what takes place. I think also we need to model a realistic faith to those outside of faith and those who are growing up in faith. You know, I think sometimes we have this idea that if I'm in a train wreck and I lose my leg, that I should hop in here the next day and tell everybody how wonderful God is. Well, God is wonderful, but I'm still really in a bad mood. Okay? And that's different than saying, you know what? I don't like this part of the journey, but I trust God anyway. It hurts. It's painful. I don't like it. I wish it'd go away, but I trust God anyway. Kind of like we talked about a couple weeks ago. All right? And then finally, we need to remember that God is trustworthy. And if he's really directing history, which the Bible teaches very clearly, if he's really directing history to accomplish his purposes and his plans, then we have to be like Job at the end of the story, where Job says, you know what? I was wrong in questioning you. You're God and I'm not. Whew, those are hard words to say because we really like to be in charge. But ultimately, we have to come back to this reality that he's God and we're not. All right? But here's some great news about valleys. They all come to an end. Every one of them. It may come to an end through death, but they come to an end. We don't have to suffer through valleys for eternity. Thank you, Jesus. They all come to an end. And so I want to encourage you today with these words. Keep pushing forward. Keep staying strong. Keep pursuing Christ. It's worth it. And maybe someday, even before this life is through, maybe you'll get to see the purpose of the valley. And you can look back and say, yeah, I see what God did there. And I see why he did it. Thank you. So stay strong, stay true, and in the valley, take advantage of the opportunity. That's why James said, consider it pure joy, my brothers, when you encounter various trials, because those trials lead you to perfection. Let's pray.